And now we get to have a fireside chat with Suneet Varma, the Global Oncology and U.S. President for Pfizer. Suneet, I would love for you to introduce yourself to our audience.
Yeah, no, actually, thank you so much. And as part of my introduction, is Mary Beth still in the room by any chance?
Right there.
So, just as part of my bio, although I wasn't necessarily thinking about this when I was introducing myself, but I am the global president for Pfizer's Oncology. But just prior to this, I was the global president for Pfizer's Rare Disease and Gene Therapies unit. And so I've been in an arc of travel over my career towards increasingly, let's say, specialized areas with really big voice from the patients. And, unfortunately, there are more cases than you can imagine with Mary Beth's situation. But fortunately, there are people like Mary Beth that really play an integral role in advocating for patients, interacting with healthcare systems, et cetera. And that has led to so much more than you can believe, not just with Congress, but with FDA, with NIH, et cetera. So an amazing story. And I often say there are 7,000 rare diseases in the world. Half of them are in oncology, which is one of the reasons I'm working in oncology today. The other half are non-oncology, such as the things that Mary Beth described with cystinosis for her daughter. So I think it's really a proof point, frankly, of the innovation thesis for our industry. It's really our reason for being. And that's what we wake up each and every day to do. I happen to also have a daughter who has a rare genetic disorder. It's my younger. I have a different story about that, but I'm not here to share that. But I'm not just, how they say, I'm not just a doctor on TV. I'm also a parent and an advocate as well. So yes, I'm the president of Pfizer's oncology division globally. I started off my career in a technical capacity. I'm an engineer by training, starting off in manufacturing and operations. But then, like many, you work alongside colleagues that are going to the marketplace to in sales and marketing or general management or medical affairs. And I say, wow, I think I could do that, And so I made the shift into general management more than 20 years ago. I've spent half my career working outside the United States in emerging markets, including Asia Pacific and China for half a dozen years. And I've worked, besides rare disease and oncology, I was also our president of our hospital unit, which treats hundreds of millions of patients per year with products that I consider to be extremely low priced and high volume. The average cost of one of our products in the hospital unit is the same as a price of a bottle of water. So just gives you a sense of, when you get into sterile injectables in the hospital unit. So it's been a great career for me because of the impact we've been able to have. 15 years now at Pfizer, 14 years at Wyeth Pharmaceuticals before that. If anybody knows their history in pharma, Pfizer acquired Wyeth, and I was conveyed, quote unquote, from Wyeth to Pfizer. So that's my career in a nutshell, and that's what brought me here today, Jennifer.
Thank you. I can go you one earlier. When I first started practicing law, we represented Wyeth, formerly known as American Home Products. So yes, I was a baby lawyer who had to write out a massive long line of former in any reply that we did on behalf.
Okay. Well, now just so you know, I actually am a legacy American Home Products person.
So see?
And I didn't say it because I thought nobody's ever heard of it. But I joined in 1993, and they were on 3rd Avenue here and 43rd Street. American Home Products is probably the worst name if you want to be a global healthcare company.
Yes.
So American is immediately limiting, and Home Products because we made Golden's mustard, pan cooking spray, Crunch and Munch popcorn, whole Lantern jams and jellies, and Chef Boyardee, if anybody knows the canned pasta.
Yes.
And we had a small division called Wyeth, heirs to McKenna, and eventually the company transformed into healthcare. But yes, that's where I originally joined as an engineer.
Yeah, you would think American Home Products would be carpet or something, right? Sorry. Okay, we digress. But in preparing for today, one of the things that I did note is you had posted last year for World Cancer Day an article on LinkedIn about a journal that you keep on the stories from people who have cancer, people you've known. Can you tell this? I think this would be really impactful for the audience to hear about this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that my journey from rare disease into oncology as a life sciences leader has really been enabled by that sort of central premise of the patients, and that form the basis of our purpose. And whereas rare disease, I had sort of a built-in passion from my own daughter. When I went into oncology, I had to think very deeply about, okay, where are we here? And I learned a couple things along the way. One is, cancer can affect anybody in the world, in any part of their body, at any age, any time. And so it's really a collection of diseases, as you might know. And unfortunately, the impact is massive. It is actually the single largest therapeutic area in the world for the pharmaceutical industry, okay? So that puts it in context when you think about that. And so I had to think about, for myself, what was my journey or interaction, like we all do, with cancer. And so I often thought about it I think about it in two lenses, and I challenge our own team to think about it. And you can do the same thing. What's the first time in your life you heard about cancer? And what's the most recent time you heard about cancer? And for me, and for all of us, the first time never changes. It's whenever it happened, that was the first time. Mm-hmm. However, unfortunately, your recent one will always change, because you'll hear a new story about a neighbor or a friend or a colleague who's had that, and that will change naturally over time. But the first time for me was when I was a young child. I had an aunt who, if anybody's South Asian, we have a term. We don't just call them aunts, we have a title for every relationship in our family, and she was what we call a masi. A masi means like a mother, and it's your mother's sister, because it's believed that essentially your mother is, of course, your mother, but then her sisters are like your mother. And she was diagnosed with ovarian cancer, and she never had any children of her own, so she really was like a mother to me, and I was like a son to her. And she passed very quickly. And I remember, and you can imagine 40 years ago, there were no treatments for ovarian cancer, especially not in New Delhi, which is where she lived. And at that time, the feelings, now think about the feelings you had the first time. It was mostly fear and confusion. Somebody had this disease, and I remember being paranoid about that. That and nuclear war were my two biggest fears as a child, because I watched this TV show called The Day After, and I was like, oh my God, it's like the world is gonna end. And my kids, for them, and now it's like global warming and Trump. But I would say that, and I'm not making a political commentary, that's what they're afraid of. But I think that that really shapes like how you think about disease and how it can affect you personally, and it can shape a lot of who you are as a human being, and when you're in a company like Pfizer or an industry like ours, what you can do to create a bigger impact in the world. So then you fast forward to, okay, what's the most recent time you heard about it? And so when I started working in oncology, I used to keep a journal of all the times I would hear about cancer, because what happens is, in the role that I'm in, I would get a lot of outreach. Somebody would call me and say, my sister was just diagnosed with a disease. Yeah. Can you help? She needs some information. Sometimes it would be, my wife, unfortunately, just succumbed after an 18-month battle. So, you have all this mix of stories you hear about. And I was getting about 2 or 3 a week. And so I kept this journal. And it was about a third. A third of the people had amazing success. A third of them were just at the beginning of their journey, and about a third had succumbed. And but then I thought about what were the emotions I now felt. It wasn't the same fear I felt, although certainly we have a long way to go, certainly in some kinds of cancers in particular. But what it shared with me is that now I have more hope, more optimism. I have more pride in what we have achieved over the last decades, because people can live much longer. In fact, we can even make it a chronic condition in some cases, which is an amazing thing. And so I'm not filled with the same fear. I can still be afraid, and I'm afraid for sometimes, no matter what you're still going to have that. But that has been an inspiration for myself and for our team. And for our researchers, we always say, think about the first time you heard about it and what you felt. Now think about the last time you heard about it and what you think now. And I think that puts the journey in perspective. This is a generational war, but we have really experienced a renaissance, not just in the last 40 years, but in the last 15 to 20. Yeah. It's been amazing, and I'm really optimistic for the future. Jennifer, anyway, that's the...
Yeah, that's what I wanted them. Yes, that's what I wanted.
This was not talked about beforehand. I got here, and she goes, I looked at your LinkedIn post, and you said something about Kanta Masi. Can you say something about her? And I said, I can, yes.
And this is, okay, so for everyone else who may in the future be interviewed by me, this is the risk when you have a litigator as your fireside chat person. Sorry, we may go off script. So let's talk more about how Pfizer is addressing cancer. We all, now I am Southern, as everyone knows, and so I pay more attention to college football than I do professional football. However, I do watch the Super Bowl, and we saw Pfizer's very interesting ad, right, at the Super Bowl this year. So talk to us about what that is as a reflection of what Pfizer is doing for patients in oncology.
Absolutely, yes. The Super Bowl did get a lot of attention, and it's only the second ad I've ever been associated with in the Super Bowl in my career. The other was in consumer healthcare, where you and I may have crossed paths in the past. But what I would say really simply is that Pfizer has learned a lot from COVID, whether it was the vaccine or whether it was the antiviral. And Pfizer essentially has said, look, what is the next biggest health challenge that we can tackle on behalf of the society or the world, the people of the world? And they basically said, that's going to be cancer. And so essentially, not just recommitting to the space, because we've been in it for, let's say, 2 decades, but really significantly committing for the next decade and the next 2 decades to how can we really achieve, essentially, if not the quote-unquote cure, but making it a chronic condition. And so how do you turn all your energy, your resources, and your focus to tackling cancer? Essentially, what we did for COVID, we would like to do for cancer. And I think that puts us in a new realm of how you can harness the power of an organization, or frankly, in industry, which is going to tackle this disease. If you go back, let's say 15 years, we had 2 or 3 medicines, and we had this small division in the company. And now we have almost 28 medicines. So, threefold, or sorry, I should say, a tenfold the number of medicines. Back then it might have been a small fraction of Pfizer. Let's call it single-digit percentages. And now it's it's actually the largest part of Pfizer beyond COVID. We treat or have indications for more than 40 different tumor types. And we've decided to focus on breast cancer, genitourinary cancers, which include prostate and bladder, hematologic malignancies, which include lymphoma, leukemia, and multiple myeloma. And then, of course, what I would call thoracic or precision medicine. So colorectal, melanoma, and lung are our biggest areas in that space. But recently, we also acquired some products from Seagen, or actually acquired the whole company, and we got into cervical cancer as well, which is a very big issue, especially in some of the international and less developed markets of the world. So I think that if you think about that and you say, well, what could this be for the future? And I can tell you that these R&D commitments, because today it's become 40% of Pfizer's R&D budget, okay? And we're a big company. We're actually, I think, the largest company at the moment, and 40% is a really big commitment to oncology. So, I have some Pfizer colleagues here. We have a plan through 2030. We have a plan through 2035. And you're not going to believe this, I now have a plan through 2042. And you might say, why 2042? Because I started the plan 2 years ago with a 20-year plan. But I mean, you have to have a lot of vision to think about what's happening beyond 2040. Yeah. But I think for Pfizer to commit to oncology in that way, it contributes to what I talked about before, which is that sense of hope, that sense of optimism. But we always say hope is not a strategy. It's what's that commitment represent in terms of applying the best science, long-term commitment to the resources, collaborations around the world to bring new treatments to bear. So I think that's a very much of where maybe a Pfizer Oncology was in 2010 versus where it could be in 2040.
So when you think about that, like you don't necessarily cover the waterfront, but I would argue close in the sort of expanded focus, right, of Pfizer on oncology. What about the science is really exciting, and what about the science is driving where you go in oncology?
Yeah, I would say the science is really moving quickly at this point, and we were historically and have been, and if anybody looks at our public reports, you'd see this, we were a traditional small molecule, make pills kind of company, and we've had amazing success there. Our biggest product is in breast cancer, where it was our CDK4/6 inhibitor, palbociclib, which we launched in 2015. It was the first in class for that kind of medicine, and it really transformed the treatment of metastatic breast cancer. And now here we are, 9 years later, it's still the leading product in the space. So that's an amazing testament. But what's been happening now is that science is taking us into new areas, just like in rare disease, where you could go into gene therapies. In cancer, companies have gone into cell therapies, and these are, let's say, the most complex biologic treatments that are out there. It's really pioneering science, high science, and for us, complex biologics have become part of our future vision. And today, if you think that's, let's say, 5 or 6% of our Pfizer Oncology business, we think that will grow to be almost 2/3 by the end of this decade. So that's a tenfold increase again, from 6% to 60%. And what are complex biological? They're very high impact medicines or treatments that heretofore were, if you go back even 5 years ago, some of them didn't even exist.
Right.
Okay, when I say didn't exist, they may not have been even in clinical trial. But they're moving so rapidly that they're now in the marketplace. Two of those that are very interesting to me are bispecific antibodies and antibody drug conjugates. Those are two places that Pfizer has committed to. And let me first describe it, bispecific antibodies. Now, I am an engineer, but I'm not a scientist. But I think of a bispecific antibody as essentially a horseshoe magnet. If anybody's ever, when they were a kid, had a horseshoe-shaped magnet, where one pole, there's a North Pole and a South Pole, one attracts the multiple myeloma cell, and it essentially latches onto it, and then the other one attracts your immune cell and latches onto it. And once the immune cell and the multiple myeloma cell are hooked onto your horseshoe magnet right next to each other, your immune system recognizes the multiple myeloma intruder and devours it. And you say to myself, well, that's an amazing technology, literally didn't exist in the marketplace, and now in the last year, 3 products have launched into the marketplace, 2 from Janssen and 1 from Pfizer in the bispecific antibody space. And you say, well, that's an amazing technology. Could it be applied to other cancers? Why not? Why is it bispecific? What about trispecifics? And so now it opens up a whole new lens or frontier for high science, and you say, engineered antibodies that essentially are extremely targeted, which give you new ways to treat cancer. Very, very exciting, and could have, essentially change the standard, are changing the standard of care, especially in the community, where they're looking for products that are not always about CAR T or bone marrow transplants and things like that. Antibody drug conjugates are a technology which actually Pfizer and Wyeth had the very first one. It was called Mylotarg, that ever existed in the world. However, now we acquired a company called Seagen, or Seattle Genetics, which has 4 products on the market, but 3 of them are antibody drug conjugates. And they're amazing in the sense that it's another, I look at it as a 3-part thing. It's an engineered antibody, and it has a little linker, which is like a little arm, and it carries a payload or a warhead, which is essentially a poison. So you put this into your body, the antibody goes and finds the place it needs to go. In this case, let's say bladder cancer or classic Hodgkin's lymphoma. It attaches, and it drops its payload or the warhead and destroys the cancer. Okay? Again, these are overly simplified descriptions, but you say, that's amazing. What other antibodies could I create?
Right.
What other warheads or payloads could I develop? What other cancers could I use this for? And you say, these are areas that people were only dreaming of when my aunt was suffering from cancer. And so I look at it and say, this is, again, complex biologics, another frontier. So the science is just going forward at such a rapid rate. And that's why the FDA has created things like RTOR, Real-Time Oncology Review. That's why rare disease has orphan drug designations. These are special classifications to nurture and foster the most innovative, the most pioneering science that could have the highest impact on patients, like today. And that's something that was even there before COVID, but we sharpened during COVID. So I think it just leads me to, new places that you can only imagine. And I sit on the R&D committees, and 90% of the time I don't know what they're talking about. But it sounds really, really interesting. And then I have to think about it and come up with my simple descriptions like the horseshoe magnet and the warheads and payloads. But that's how I keep it straight. But I have so much confidence in the scientists that we have, and I think about the amazing things they're thinking about, and they're just light years ahead of where we could even dreamed we would be. So very exciting, science-driven, patients at the center. And you put it together and you say, wow.
So if we have this potential, what could hamper Pfizer's ability to get these new cutting-edge therapeutics, treatments, cures to patients? And what worries you about that?
Yeah, I think we have a little bit of schizophrenia, and I apologize for the metaphor, but in our government and in other governments around policies, where I happen to for example, Joe Biden declared his cancer moonshot, and he declared it on the 60th anniversary of when JFK declared his actual moonshot, and Biden announced his cancer moonshot at the Kennedy Library in Boston, and I attended that, by the way. And to hear his vision for cutting cancer deaths in half, or changing cancer as we know it by 2050. And I was very inspired, and I say, well, this is the kind of commitment we need to take on these most serious human health challenges. But at the same time, then you go to other parts of the US government, and you say, or the European government, and they have policies that are the opposite of that. And one of them is the Inflation Reduction Act, which essentially says that they're going to reduce or truncate the time that a product would be on the market before it would be subject to CMS negotiation. Now, I get that. We want, let's say, there are good parts of the IRA, like patient out-of-pocket caps. We like that. But what it says also is that if you want to develop a medicine later in its life cycle for treating certain cancer populations, you're essentially reducing the time that we can make the investment in those clinical trials. People may not know this, but 60% of cancer indications come in the latter part of the life cycle of a product. And if you truncate the end of a life cycle, well, then those clinical trials might never get started. And some people have gone on the record and saying, we're no longer going to do these trials because we won't have time to do the trials and launch those indications. Because before we would have 17 years, and now we're going to have 13 years, or we're going to have 9 years. And so that really reduces the opportunity. I would go one step further. With the orphan drug, they have said that if you have 2 indications, you're no longer allowed to operate without pricing from CMS, pricing negotiations. And so what that means, and I've seen rare disease companies come out and say this, well, I was studying this in 2 rare disease populations because I was going for 2 indications. Now I'm only going to do clinical trials in 1 rare disease population or 1 indication. That's terrible, because basically what it's saying is that you are going, the government is basically creating a policy which is reducing the incentive for innovation in small patient populations, whereas before it would be able to do it, we would be able to do these under the normal planning time horizons that we should have. So in the case of oncology, less studies and less indications potentially. In the case of rare disease, fewer indications to start. And so I think I don't understand how that fits with the cancer moonshot. Right. How are we going to cut 50% of the deaths and have change cancer as we know it, but at the same time we're reducing the current incentives. Now, listen, I'm not trying to say they shouldn't be, we're not out there saying we want more, although I could. But I would say that, what about just the way it's now? We want incentives or something that's going to make it more, to do more studies or to do more research, not less. And I think that's what's concerning me about some of the things that I'm seeing.
Well, and it's also creating this false requirement for companies to choose indications or populations that they will try to address, right? Like in your rare disease example, if you're studying one indication but you think it might work in another, and then you have to pick. And not only is that unfair to the patient population that needs treatments, it's also unfair to the company, because that may be their only product that the company is working on. So I think that there are small company issues as well as large company issues that will flow from the Inflation Reduction Act that may or may not have been unintended consequences.
I think that's right. And if I could just say one thing, just to clarify. So at Pfizer, we get asked this question a lot: are you canceling clinical? The answer is no. We've decided that we're going to keep doing what we do. Okay? So we are not reducing our clinical trials. I am not. But there are other companies in our industry that have declared that they're going to change their development programs, which populations they study, what's the timing of that. And it's just unfortunate, because I think that's not what was the intended consequence. And I feel we're doing the right thing by keeping everything going, but I get challenged a lot, especially by external. Why are you still doing that? And so it's not just the internal decisions, but the external pressure as well. So it's not what I ever imagined I'd be facing.
So because we have a mix of industry, patients, caregivers here today, what advice would you give to patients who they're clearly here because they want to engage? What would you tell them about engaging, changing the narrative from the policy perspective?
Yeah, I would say if you ever heard the phrase, if you see something, say something, which is, what we did. And I know it has a connotation in the New York City subways and variety of signs. And it's more about security, homeland security. But I look at it, this is very similar, which is if you see something, say something. Like what Mary Beth said before, what looks at, I was in a congressman's office, or I was able to have my voice heard. Those are incredibly powerful. You'd be surprised how much power we actually have that we don't realize and don't exercise. And I think that we have, so I could say, schedule an appointment with your local representative, write a letter to your elected officials, join a patient advocacy group, make a small contribution if you wanted to something that's of high interest to you. And I do that for the diseases that I'm personally connected with as well. So I think that there's a whole host, because you might feel like, not in this room, because I consider us to be generally connected, otherwise we wouldn't be here.
Right.
We're generally more enlightened and interested, which otherwise we wouldn't be here. But I think we can ourselves and influence others that if they see something, let's do something. And there are lots of ways to get involved and engaged and help. And some things are very simple, like, I want to have a meeting. Sometimes you see people picketing that we want this medicine and we want this study, and that's very helpful as well. So I think that at the end of the day, it's not one person or one organization making great things happen. I often say it's literally tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people making things happen. And in the ecosystem that we're operating, all the stakeholders coming together, industry, academia, government, policymakers, patient advocacy, nurses or other healthcare professionals, doctors, it's when they come together, that alignment is like, this April 8th solar eclipse, it happens. And it's just like the power and the imagination and the impact is fantastic. It's far beyond what we could ever imagine. We sometimes feel like, oh, well, what am I going to do? But in fact, when it happens, and it has happened, it's amazing. So I think we can all take that as a personal mandate, let's say.
Thank you so much, Suneet, for joining us today. We really appreciate the conversation, and we will have a short networking break now, and we'll be back here in just a little bit. Thank you.